Dear Rector, guests, colleagues and students, good afternoon and welcome to the first of ODTÜ's 60th anniversary honorary lecture series. The university has been organizing various activities this academic year as part of its celebrations, and honorary lecture series is one of them. You can have more information actually on these activities as well as the fall program of the honorary lecture series from our website. ODTÜ Honorary Lecture Series is organized by a committee consisting of Professors Feride Acar, Yavuz Ataman, Canan Özgen, and myself. The names to be invited has been decided based on the suggestions from the faculties, and today it's my pleasure to introduce to you our first keynote speaker, Robert Jessop, and I thank him for accepting our invitation. Bob Jessop is a distinguished professor of sociology and co-director of the Cultural Political Economy at Lancaster University, UK. He studied sociology at Exeter University and has a PhD from Cambridge University, Faculty of Economics and Politics. He's, of course, very well known for his far-reaching contribution to state theory and has been in the forefront of the debates on political economy. His major contribution to state theory has been his conceptualization of the state as situated in a wider social relations with different strategic effects. He is also a leading scholar of political economy, particularly with his studies on the analysis of welfare state restructuring, the critique of neoliberalism, critical governance studies, and more recently, the role of culture in political economy. He recently completed a 3.5-year professorial research fellowship exploring the North Atlantic financial crisis and the Eurozone crisis from a cultural political economy perspective, investigating both the structural roots of the crisis and the struggle to interpret and manage the crisis. The results of this research have been published in journal articles and book chapters. His other recent work includes State Power, a Strategic Relational Approach, which was published in 2007, Towards a Cultural Political Economy, Putting Culture in its Place in Political Economy, which was co-authored and published in 2013, Cultures of Finance and Crisis Dynamics. He was a co-editor and contributor to this book, which was published in 2014, and The State, Past, Present, and Future, which was published in 2015. So it's my honor to present to you Professor Bob Jessop to give his talk. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great honor to be invited back to METU. I've been here, I think, at least 6 times, and it's more times to METU than to any other university in Turkey, which I think is a sign of its significance in the social science ferment and more generally in the firmament and more generally in the university system here in Turkey. I am known for some rather heavy theoretical lifting that I do in my work, but knowing that the audience here is a mixture of people who may be familiar with my work, some who have some vague understanding of what social scientists do, and some that may be really mysterious as to whether we're really a science or just a sort of art form where we amuse ourselves talking to each other. I decided it wouldn't be too theoretically heavy, and certainly not meta-theoretically heavy. Some of my students have a joke about me, saying that anything you can do, Bob can do meta. Well, I will not be doing anything meta today, but trying to keep things at a fairly simple level. I can't guarantee that I will keep my promises, but I will do my best, and certainly there will be, by design, plenty of opportunity for discussion at the end. You'll see, I hope you'll have recognized where this opening slide comes from. If you don't, then either you weren't present at the event or you don't read the METU homepage. But when I saw this slide or this picture on the METU homepage, it made immediate sense to begin my presentation with this. But I will ask you not to expect me to talk about the topic of political capitalism and the crisis of the state specifically in relation to Turkey. I'm always here to learn when I come to Turkey, but I would expect, indeed encourage you to ask questions drawn from my presentation also about the current conjuncture in Turkey if you wish to. It's not compulsory, there are many other things to discuss, but that may be one of the issues that you want to raise. So let me tell you what I'm going to do. And firstly, I'm going to say a little bit about METU, because one of the reasons why I've come here so often, I feel it's my home in Turkey. And I'll explain why that is. Then I'm going to pose a very general question, which isn't specific to the social sciences, certainly not specific to economics or politics, what we mean when we talk about crises. And on that basis, I'm going to introduce a term that I've begun to work with quite closely during the last 2 to 3 years, symptomatology. And I'll explain what that is and then apply the ideas about crisis and symptomatology to the North Atlantic financial crisis. You heard in the introductory remarks, I've been working on the North Atlantic financial crisis and the Eurozone crisis, both from a semiotic, from an interpretive viewpoint, and in terms of its underlying dynamics rooted in the nature of contemporary political economy. And I want to interpret the North Atlantic financial crisis as the product not of market capitalism, but of political capitalism. And that's when I start to move into the question of political capitalism and the crisis of the state. So I'll be talking briefly about capitalism and democracy, the conditions for that correlation, political crises, the rise of authoritarian statism, and if there's time, the enduring austerity state. All of those worried about writing things down furiously, the PowerPoint will be circulated after the event, fine-tuned in the light of any questioning. And, okay, thank you. We have to avoid that, but we don't want people not to hear me. So I think that's about right, is it? Okay. You've not lost anything because it's all on that first PowerPoint slide anyway. And then some conclusions. I may not get to the end because I don't want to talk for more than 45 minutes or so, but those slides I don't deal with. I can either refer to in the discussion or you'll get to see in any case. So moving on. These are 5 out of 7 mission statements from METU. I'm not here to publicize the university, but just to explain why it is I feel METU is my home. An emphasis on a scientific approach, and that's not always to be found in universities, on academic freedom, and I think that's a very strong Humboldtian principle, the principle of learning freedom and of teaching freedom, and I want to emphasize that. But one of the reasons I feel particularly at home is the commitment to interdisciplinarity. I describe my own approach as pre-disciplinary in inspiration. We can't turn the clock back and reinvent the pre-disciplinary age, so I can only be inspired by it. As transdisciplinary in perspiration, because it takes a lot of hard work to do interdisciplinary work, and post-disciplinary in aspiration, because what we should be doing is trying to break through the cognitive and epistemological blinkers that come from being too closely identified with an individual discipline, where most of the important problems in the world do not come neatly packaged to be studied by this discipline or that discipline. So any university that wants to make a difference, certainly in terms of dealing with problems in the real world, is required to adopt a transdisciplinary perspiration perspective and aim to overcome disciplinary blinkers. And as my mother said when I announced to her at the age of 18 that I was getting married and expecting a child, "You'll never finish your education." She's right, I never did finish my education, and I'm still going strong. My son's now 50, and he's also going strong in similar sort of disciplines, so we can do lifelong learning and pass the love of learning on. And finally, of course, the training of qualified people. But as I said, whenever I come to METU, 6-7 occasions now, including this, I meet people from many different disciplines, and we have many interesting discussions. And I feel, as I've said, very at home here. So this is one of the reasons why I was more than happy to accept the invitation, not knowing I would be the first to make a presentation, because it's a bit more difficult to judge the genre in those contexts. But anyway, moving on. Crises, what crises? And if you saw my opening slide after the one of the peace demonstration at METU, you'll have seen that I used, as many people do, the old cliche, that is the Chinese ideogram for crisis, which combines two characters for danger and opportunity. And I think it's a very good way to begin to think about the nature of crises, because they are indeed moments of danger and opportunity. As such, they have both objective and subjective aspects. The objective aspect is the genesis, the etiology, the causes of the objective threat. The subjective aspect is how do we construe the crisis? How do we interpret that? So objectively, crises occur when a set of social relations, including their ties to the natural world, and it's important to emphasize that even more nowadays given the worries about climate change and so forth, cannot be reproduced. In other words, can't go on in the old way. Subjectively, however, they're moments of indeterminacy, where decisive action can repair what cannot at the moment continue, lead to change, or prompt radical innovation. And continuing the theme of what crises are, I like to distinguish crises along two axes. Crises, the first axis, crises as accidental products of natural or external forces, a tsunami, crop failure, SARS invasion, although very often what we consider or define as accidental isn't really. Just to give you an example of a tsunami, the tsunami in Thailand had the devastating effects that it did because of World Bank initiatives to encourage shrimp farming, which destroys mango forests, which provides or destroys the natural buffer that exists between the sea and habitation. So often things that are considered to be accidental may not be, and this is a working distinction. It's always worthwhile saying, is it really accidental? Was this an accident waiting to happen? And so forth. You might look at the Katrina hurricane and New Orleans in that context, also in terms of austerity, insufficient attention paid to repairing levees and so forth. But much more interesting from a social science viewpoint are crises as being structurally determined. That is to say, identifying inherent crisis potentials and the tendencies associated with a given social form, with matching patterns of crisis management. Crises aren't extraordinary events. They're often presented as such, but they happen routinely. Every 7 years, for at least the last 35 years, there's been a major financial crisis. If you look at business cycles, big technological revolutions and so forth, crises are in fact quite routine. And people over time develop ways of dealing with crises. And that's the second axis of my discussion. Crises are normal. That is to say that they are expected and they may be resolved through established crisis management routines that are learnt over time as one finds out more about the nature of the crisis, by trying to manage it. And I'll refer to that idea again when I come to the idea of symptomatology. But there are also crises of a system. And Klaus Offer, one of the well-known German political scientists, made this point particularly clearly. He said crises in are not really a problem. The crises that really matter are crises of crisis management, when our routines of dealing with crises no longer work. And those are the more profound, more disorienting, more disturbing crises. And those are the ones that really bring about major changes, whereas crises in, the normal ones, can often act as a purgative effect, have a renewal effect, be a means of regeneration. And if we look at crises as objectively overdetermined threats, which are also opportunities, in other words, subjectively indeterminate, we can see why crises are particularly good entry points for social scientists to undertake analyses. Because what crises do is they tend to disrupt or to shock accepted views of the world. One of my favorite political scientists, political theorists, is Nikos Poulantzas, a Greek theorist, and he describes crises as profoundly disturbing, profoundly disorienting. And I think this is very good because they provide an entry point into what a queer theorist might call queering the normal, calling into question what we take for granted. They call into question theoretical and policy paradigms as well as everyday routines. I'll give you just an illustration of that. It's not in my PowerPoint, but it's a particularly telling one. The Senate committee, House committee in the Congress of the United States invited Alan Greenspan to give an interview, to be interviewed, in fact interrogated, in 2008. And they asked him, Representative Henry Waxman said, Mr. Greenspan, do you think that your ideology led you to make decisions you wish now you had not made? And he didn't question the idea that he had an ideology. I would have done. I mean, it's a leading question to begin with. What I said, no, I have a theory of how the world works. But he said, no, of course I have an ideology. Everybody, to exist, you need an ideology. What that means is a way of understanding the world. So it's not a question of whether you have an ideology or not, but whether it's flawed or not. And I've been very saddened by the fact that I have discovered a flaw in my ideology, a flaw in the way in which I thought the world worked, so to speak. And I've been very distressed by that fact. He didn't explain what his ideology was, but it was the efficient market hypothesis, that he'd been running the United States economy on the assumption that markets were efficient, that financial markets could be left to their own devices to self-regulate and so forth. And so the point about the North Atlantic financial crisis in this context is it shocked all of those that believed in efficient markets. It shocked a lot of other people as well, but particularly it shocked Greenspan and his colleagues trying to understand then what one does in this rather unusual situation that is not meant to happen, and for which many crisis management routines that had worked in periods of unemployment, in periods of inflation, wouldn't work in the context of a financial crisis. So just continuing that theme, what crises do is to threaten established views, practices, institutions, social relations. They provide an opportunity for reflection. What mistake did I make about the nature of the real world that I've now found out is flawed? Opportunities for learning in, about, and from crisis. And another thing that one could look at is the pedagogy of crises. What does one learn when the crisis emerges? What does one learn when one tries to make sense of the crisis? What does one learn when one tries to solve the crisis and at first your attempts don't work? And what lessons does one draw after a crisis in order to try to avoid it in future? Of course, it can lead to the reassertion of old ideas. If only we hadn't strayed from traditional values and beliefs, this wouldn't have happened, or it can point forward. In other words, crises are very interesting phenomena from a social scientific view. I don't mean by that I wish we could have more crises because there would be more opportunities to do research. I wish we could avoid crises, but if they're going to occur, then at least we can try to understand why they occur, what their systemic roots are, how to avoid them getting worse, and so forth. So moving on again, one of my favorite state theorists, Antonio Gramsci, far more than a state theorist, talking on the crisis in the 1930s, in one of his prison notebooks, said, "Whoever wants to give one sole definition of these events, or what is the same thing, find a single cause or origin must be rebutted, must be refuted. We are addressing a process that shows itself in many ways and in which causes and effects become intertwined and mutually entangled. To simplify means to misrepresent and to falsify." And again, what that does is to point out that when a crisis occurs, it is not immediately legible. It's this kind of crisis or that kind of crisis. It is, in fact, a point of contestation and struggle what the nature of that crisis is. And he continues, this is the same note, when did the crisis begin? The question's bound up with the first, since we're dealing with a process and not an event. It's hard in real terms to separate the economic crisis from political and ideological ones, especially if, like Alan Greenspan, you think the cause is your ideology, the efficient market hypothesis. I would just say that's a paradigm or policy paradigm mistake. Crises have many spatio-temporal complexities that affect social forces in different ways. So different forces will have different readings of the same crisis. And if you're not quite sure when it began or how extensive it is, you've got additional problems, and it may even be difficult to speak of the crisis. And in fact, when people manage to talk about the crisis and get everybody to agree this is the nature of the crisis, there's already a number of political victories or ideological victories that have been secured to get people to agree this is the nature of the crisis rather than something else. So in terms of something you referred to in your opening remarks, cultural political economy, which tries to walk on two legs, understanding sense and meaning making and understanding structural dynamics, getting consensus on an interpretation about which of many crises matters is to have framed the problem. But not all crisis interpretations are sufficiently coherent that they can be translated into at least attempts at policy making and policy solving, and not all attempts that are made actually work. So if you think in terms of evolutionary theory, we can understand crisis construals as also being subject to variation, selection, and retention. And it would be nice to believe that it's the scientifically accurate bases or construals that win out rather than the others, but that's one of the points that I want to question. And in order to question it, I want to do something that most people might not have expected of me, and go back to medieval theology. You might have expected that of Ernesto Laclau, those of you familiar with his work, but not necessarily of Bob Jessop, his sworn enemy, or not quite his sworn enemy. But St. Augustine of Hippo, in 389 AD, drew a very interesting distinction between what he called signa data and signa naturalia. He distinguished conventional signs from natural signs. He says a sign is something that, offering itself to the senses, conveys something other to the intellect. Very simple terms, no smoke without fire. So the smoke offers itself to the senses, but it's a sign of something else, possibly a fire. Signa data depend on words or other conventional signs. So anybody who knows anything about Saussurean linguistics knows that dog and the sound dog are correlated. And that can be purely conventional. But it's much more interesting to look at what Augustine of Hippo described as signa naturalia, natural signs, because they point to something more. Smoke, the sound, and smoke, the word, would keep us at the level of Saussurean linguistics. There's no smoke without fire, looks at smoke and fire also as a sign of something beyond the conventions that we're talking about. It points beyond the signum signans relationship. Sorry, somebody should be waving at me if I only move my screen forward and I don't move this forward, right? So this is what I've just read out to you. Can I appoint somebody to wave at me if I make a mistake and don't move the presentation forward? It's so difficult for me.
You did it on purpose.
No. It's just I can't read the screen at this angle, so I'm following my screen. Let's just quickly. So the importance of interpreting crisis, governing crisis. St. Augustine, and we've just got to that point in the discussion. And now I will move on and do this thing simultaneously, right? So I just want to talk a little bit more about signa data, signa naturalia. Signa naturalia are symptoms of an underlying reality. The outward manifestations of some other fact, an internal condition, a quality, or an overall state of affairs. Again, a very simple example, no smoke without fire. There's an objective relationship between the invisible entity, the fire, the only evidence we have of it is the smoke, and the visible sign, but it's underdetermined. There's no one-to-one relationship between the sign, the visible symptom, and the underlying cause. And no algorithm that will enable you to do that. I understand one of the next lectures is love and mathematics in the age of artificial intelligence. I would be very interesting to know whether we've yet got to symptoms and mathematics in the age of artificial intelligence to know exactly what the nature of the North Atlantic financial crisis was. I doubt whether there's an algorithm that can help us there. Certainly not on the macro scale one would need to deal with it. So crises become visible through their symptoms, but those symptoms are not immediately legible. And from ancient times, there have been many ways of interpreting that. One of the things I did when I was working on symptomatology was to go back and look at Greek medicine, Babylonian medicine, Arab medicine, medieval medicine, and did indeed discover that Hippocrates was not the only doctor in town. There were major disputes among different medieval and ancient Greek Babylonian schools about how to interpret the symptoms, even of diseases that people were familiar with. And that's doubled up and tripled up when one comes to sort of major social crises rather than those at the level of the body or physiology. And so major problem, what's the relationship between the symptom and the underlying cause? And this is when I introduced the idea of symptomatology. So the challenge when we're faced with a crisis and faced then with crisis construal and crisis management is to relate the empirical symptoms to the actual crisis, whether that's understood as an event or a process, and to the underlying real mechanisms causing it, as the basis for possible and possibly decisive interventions. And this is what I call the field of symptomatology. And I think it is something that calls out for an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary approach when we look at the sorts of crises that worry us today, especially the big, almost civilizational crises challenging us, how one makes sense of the relationship between symptom and underlying causes is a major problem. And even when we have fairly well-established crisis routines, nonetheless, symptomatology requires trial and error observation and construal that draw on past experience, but may also require forgetting to ensure correct intervention. And this is one of the other interesting points to be made in relation to the mission statement of METU, the commitment to science, because I'm going to suggest that, in fact, one can't just be committed to science, but one must be committed to something more. And let's just move on. I'm going to miss that one over because I'm running short of time. I'm going to pose the question of crisis construals, whether they are true or correct. And I'm going to suggest that we can look at the crisis construal, the attempt to move from the actual or the empirical symptoms to the actual symptoms to the underlying causes, and we can assess it in two ways. One is in terms of scientific validity, and in other words, have they got the right etiology of this crisis? So at the level of explanation and at the level of present description, one can start to assess explanations in terms of scientific validity, with all due recognition of the fact that, particularly as we move away from the hard sciences into the social sciences, and within the social sciences from harder sciences to softer sciences, what we even understand by science is going to be, in one way or another, influenced by a whole series of different other kinds of assumption, including, for example, whether or not the efficient market hypothesis is more than a mathematical ideology or an accurate account of how modern economies operate. But in terms of crisis, in terms of the old cliche, threat and opportunity, how can you scientifically assess what is subjectively indeterminate? What is there as an opportunity? What is there in potentia? And I think we find in crises, again, another reason why they're very interesting, is a radical asymmetry in the nature of a crisis as a threat and as an opportunity, in terms of its scientific interest and in terms of its interest as an opportunity. And it's in that context that I think you can also look at construals in terms of their correctness. I don't mean by that political correctness, and I don't mean by that scientific correctness. I'm ruling both of those possibilities out, but the capacity to transform conjunctural potentials, the crisis considered as an opportunity, into reality by guiding action. And that depends on the limits set by the objectively overdetermined form of crisis, by the interpretive and mobilizing power of different strategic perspectives, and by the balance of forces associated with different construals. Again, not in my presentation, but some of you may be familiar with a statement made, among others, by Rahm Emanuel, who was the person in charge of President-elect Obama's transition team. When interviewed on Bloomberg television, he was asked, and what are you going to be doing? And he said, you should never let a serious opportunity go to waste. Now, that wasn't a scientific statement. It might have been a scientific generalization, but it certainly wasn't a scientific prediction. It was a speculative bet on what or how one might be able to use the crisis to bring about change that might not otherwise have occurred. And I think that's the most interesting feature of crises, which they invite us not merely to engage in scientific analysis, but also to try to make sense of what exists in potentia in a particular conjuncture. And what exists in potentia is both a speculative bet on the future, if you like, a cognitive bet, but it also requires political commitment. It requires the mobilization of resources. It requires the mobilization of actors and so forth. And I think this is why crises are so interesting from a social science viewpoint, but also from the viewpoint of a university is not only committed to science and to interdisciplinarity, but also, and I didn't include this in the list of mission statements, making a difference to the world. In other words, you've got to step outside a strictly, rigidly scientific framework to begin to debate either internally or with the wider civil society, what exists in potentia in the context of crisis. Now I'm going to have to speed up, and let me see how I'm going to do that. This is effectively, I think, what I've said, that basically, if you can read what exists in potentia, I'm just having trouble with this one now. We'll get there. That's it. If you can foresee what exists in potentia, and you can make it happen, in fact, your interpretation has truth effect. It's not that it was true before you tried, but becomes true as a result of a successful intervention. And that also is a very interesting aspect of what it means to take crises as your object of analysis. I've got 2 quick slides. I'm going to deal with those quickly, and then I'm going to take 10 minutes, I think. Is that right? To round up the analysis. And I'm going to speed up, and this is why I got my preemptive strike in early by saying whatever slides I don't present will be available to you later, or I might refer to them in the presentation. This is a well-known economist, no longer taught in most mainstream economics departments, but nonetheless important. Right. Can we move on? Yes, thank you. Right. The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they're right and when they're wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. I'm sure that the power of vested interests is vastly exaggerated compared with the gradual encroachment of ideas. And I can do this one myself. The other side of that, and I'm afraid I think there's more truth on this side than on the other side. This is my favorite definition of power. It comes from Karl Deutsch. Power is the ability not to have to learn from your mistakes. And I think we might say, in the context of the North Atlantic financial crisis, there's an awful lot of not learning from one's mistakes going on. It may be that these two things are related, that the continuing power of the efficient market hypothesis, notwithstanding its apparent refutation, has something to do with power. But it is very important that one doesn't try to understand crises purely in terms of cognition, but also in terms of the politics. And that brings me to the North Atlantic financial crisis. And here, in the spirit of continuing to make Chinese references, I think here we have a case of the rectification of names. When an economic crisis made in the United States broke out in Asia, they called it the Asian crisis. When an economic crisis made in the United States broke out in the United States, they called it the global financial crisis. They always have an alibi. And so I think we could begin with the rectification of names. It was the North Atlantic financial crisis, and that tells you something about its genesis. And, well, you're reading ahead of me, I hope. It occurred in a world market dominated by neoliberalism. It depends on variegation in the character of capitalism. It's not just the product of one kind of capitalism. It was a financial crisis, and financialization is more than the growth of financial activities relative to other sectors of financialization of everyday life. And here, many of you will expect me to use Marx at this point. In my own work I have, and Marx is in this table, but here's on the left-hand side, trade in free markets and the rational organization of capitalist production. But what's interesting about the North Atlantic financial crisis is that you could never have got the North Atlantic financial crisis as the product of the spontaneous operation of market forces. Financialization was created in and through 3 kinds of political capitalism that Max Weber refers to. Profit from unusual deals with political authority, profit on the market from force and domination, predatory political profits. If you ask how it was possible for finance to become so deregulated, it wasn't because of the market. It was because of political action in the United States and then spread elsewhere. I'm going to speed up. There's more that could be said about that. But if we now go back to the crisis and think in terms of political capitalism, the North Atlantic financial crisis arose from capitalist speculation and finance, not from free trade in markets and capitalist production. It was enabled by unusual deals with political authority, the deregulation of finance, the rising income and wealth inequalities, which were politically facilitated, and predatory political profits, especially primitive accumulation, privatization, deregulation, and so forth. It took a specific form because of the hyper-financialization of the economies, the massive expansion of what Warren Buffett was pleased to call weapons of mass financial destruction. So it's not just finance, boring banking, but a specific form of financialization. And it's triggered crises elsewhere. How am I doing? Have I got 5 minutes? 10 minutes, okay, right. We may even do it and get almost to the end of the last slide. And what I want to do is to suggest that we won't actually understand the crisis by looking at it in terms of the analyses offered by and large in Marx's Capital. You will if you look at some of his writings on finance, but it has to be understood as a very specific form of financial crisis and not just as an extension or knock-on effect from an industrial crisis, not just something that it generated or emerging out of the circuits of industrial capital, but something that emerges out of the increasing separation, politically mediated and supported and reinforced, of the separation of productive capital and financial capital. And basically it's a pattern of accumulation in which profit making occurs increasingly through financial channels rather than trade and commodity production, and it relies on increasingly fictitious forms of credit, fictitious capital, and fictitious profits. And if you know you build a house on sand, the longer the boom lasts, the worse the crisis becomes when you see, as again, I think it was Warren Buffett put out, when the tide goes out, you see who's been swimming naked, who's been relying on fictitious credit, fictitious capital, and fictitious profits. And that reflects the systemic weight and power of financial markets. But the point I want to make is we talk about them as financial markets, but actually they're politically created and reproduced markets, and not just something that emerged out of the spontaneous operation of economic forces. There is, of course, a wider context. We talk about the global financial crisis, but it was more than that. It's also a global environmental crisis, a crisis of US hegemony within the post-75 global order, a crisis of neoliberalism, a crisis of finance-dominated growth, a crisis in particular strategic sectors. What's interesting, and this goes back to the point that I made when I referred to Antonio Gramsci, what is the crisis? What's interesting is it came to be defined as a financial crisis requiring financial remedies. One of the things that emerged out of my research was the way in which the financial crisis knocked the environmental crisis, the Green New Deal, ecology, renewability, and so forth off the political agenda. The immediate imperative was rescue the banks, and the next imperative was get the economy growing again regardless. So other aspects of the crisis, which actually are much more fundamental, much more threatening, much more damaging in the long term, were knocked off the political agenda, at least the mainstream, the dominant political agenda, by the way in which the crisis was interpreted. To rescue the banks rather than to rescue underwater homeowners, to ensure that too big to fail banks were kept safe. I'm going to skip over the section on neoliberalism because there is a lot that could be said about the nature of neoliberalism. I simply want at this stage to make a strong correlation between financialization, finance-dominated accumulation and what I'm referring to as hyper-financialization, and the development of neoliberalism, especially neoliberal regime shifts, the principled rollback of post-war settlements and the rollout of neoliberalism. You find neoliberalism in other contexts, but where hyper-financialization emerged, where financialization emerged, was in the Reaganite, the Thatcherite, the more principled and more radical forms of transformation. Sorry, I have to. And this is a nice quotation, which I think identifies some of the irrationalities of neoliberalism. And this is a former US ambassador, but I mean, it looks as if on this basis almost anybody can become a US ambassador nowadays. We now live in a nation where doctors destroy health, lawyers destroy justice, universities destroy knowledge. I'm sure that's not true of METU. Governments destroy freedom, the press destroys information, religion destroys morals, and our banks destroy the economy. In other words, the substantive purposes of doctors, lawyers, universities as professions has been perverted by the interest in profit maximization, returns to investment, and so forth. And it perverts what should be a commitment to substantive use values, to use a Marxian term, over subordinating them to the pursuit of profit, revenue, and so forth. So this is why it matters. I'm moving on again. Where are we? Yes, the economic and the political crisis. I've already indicated that economic crises, indeed also political crises, can be moments of renewal. They're not major threats. And in fact, economic crises are not particularly serious if they are allowed to run their course and if they occur regularly enough to become a steering mechanism rather than a major cause of crisis. And generally speaking, economic crises in and of themselves are not serious threats to the stability of a society. What is a serious threat is where the economic crisis is combined with a political crisis. To give you just a very simple illustration, the economic crisis in the United States in the 1930s was more severe than the economic crisis in Nazi Germany, or not yet Nazi Germany. The difference was democratic institutions worked in the United States and eventually produced the New Deal, FDR, and so forth. And state crisis, political crisis of varying kinds blocked political renewal through a democratic process and created the conditions for Nazism as an exceptional regime to come in to power. So what's interesting is the correlation between economic and political crisis in terms of the consequences of economic crisis. And very often what we get from an economic crisis is an economic state of emergency. And just as I indicated, financial crises are becoming very routine. More and more now we're seeing economic states of emergency created, which justify a whole series of exceptional measures being taken, which would in normal circumstances be considered completely against the rule of law and so forth. I'll give you again a very quick example. Geithner went to the United States Congress just after the really day of doom in the United States and said, unless you pass the targeted asset relief program today, the world economy is doomed. And they held out for a week before they passed it, 2,300 pages of legislation that nobody had read. And indeed, the banks were rescued, not the underwater house owners, the people who lost their jobs and so forth. Economic states of emergency don't threaten the territorial sovereignty of states, but they certainly threaten the temporal sovereignty of states. Politics takes time. Democratic politics takes even longer. The more and more economic crises are handled in and through states of economic emergency, the more and more we lose democratic opportunity to influence. I'm going to speed up again. Let's see where we go. So essentially what I'm arguing is this. There used to be a very powerful argument with a very strong underlying historical and institutional rationality that the market economy, the profit-oriented, market-mediated economy, fits well with liberal democracy. It was one of the justifications for condemning communism but supporting authoritarian dictatorships in Latin America, and I'm sure also in Turkey, because as long as you protect private property, an authoritarian regime can't be that bad after all, and the logic of the market will bring about democratization. What I want to suggest, and this is really the point of my presentation, is that the days when, if ever there were a natural fit between capitalism and democracy, is disappearing. The reason for that can be traced back to, and let me go back quickly, here, what we're seeing is a decline in the importance of that kind of capitalism that Marx discussed in Das Kapital, trade in free markets and the rational organization of capitalist production, and an increasing importance of political capitalism. The correlation between capitalism and democracy is the correlation between a capitalism based on trade in free markets, the rational organization of capitalist production, freedom of association, etc., trade union rights, and so on and so on, and the overwhelming importance of the market as the steering mechanism. The more and more that profit depends upon ties and links with the political system, the more and more a system organized, political capitalism organized on the basis of fictitious credit, fictitious capital, fictitious profits emerges, the more and more state intervention is necessary to keep it going. The more and more profitability depends upon the state. The more and more profitability depends on denying territorial and temporal sovereignty, denying the need for politics to take time and for democratic politics to take even longer. The less and less an increasingly tightly interwoven economic and political elite can allow democracy to flourish. So in addition to any general tendencies that one might see towards authoritarian statism, my firm belief is that the increasing importance of financialization and hyper-financialization, the increasing supremacy of financial capital over productive capital, the increased importance of its profitability upon unusual deals with political authority and predatory political profits, the less and less capitalism in this context can afford democracy. So my title was Political Capitalism and the Crisis of the State. I think they are closely related. I've talked about political capitalism in the context of the advanced capitalist economies. I haven't talked about it in other contexts, emerging markets, developing economies, and there political capitalism has been there almost at the beginning and not something that developed at a much later stage. So it would be very interesting to do a comparative analysis between the dynamics of political capitalism and the decline of liberal democracy in the formerly advanced capitalist economies, and compare it with the dynamics of what you were calling rentier capitalism over lunch and the other kinds of developmental state and so forth, and whether there is going to be a crossover, that these could become more liberal, more market-oriented, and less dependent on the state, or whether we're going to see, as a result of the overall logic of capital accumulation on a global scale, that bad practice drives out good practice, and this is going to spread. And two worrying signs, and this is going to be my last point, two worrying signs in this regard are the attempt under neoliberal aegis to further integrate the world market through processes such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Treaty, trade and investment services and so forth, all of which are being negotiated behind closed doors, where many decisions are already being made in the in the European Union on the assumption it's going to be enacted, and where ordinary people will not, us are not even going to be able to see what's in these treaties for 4 years after they've been agreed. That seems to me political capitalism. That seems to me to entail, if not a crisis of the state, at least a crisis in liberal democracy. And at that point, I'm going to throw things open to the floor. All of those beautiful slides prepared lovingly over the last hour or so will be available to you for download once they're circulated. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. This doesn't work. Okay, thank you so much for this thought-provoking and excellent presentation. Now the floor is open for discussion, for questions. I will take 3 or 4 questions at a time. Okay, please. That's better. I couldn't see.
Thank you very much for this eye-opening presentation. My name is Halil Bağ Karabudak. I am a METU trained economist. I am teaching at the Bilkent University School of Law. We share a common interest in Nikos Poulantzas, but my question regards what you have left off, at the point that you have left off, the North Atlantic financial crisis. Mm-hmm. What do you think about the other side of the Atlantic? That's the European Union. Because your examples and your analysis was more often than not focused on the United States part of the story. So what do you think about the European Union and where is it going? Thank you very much.
Very good question. It's different.
Bob, can we return back to Weber's scheme?
Which?
Weber's scheme, political capitalism, rational capitalism.
Oh, okay, to Weber. Yeah. Yes?
This is a question of clarification. I find this concept of political capitalism a bit confusing on my own behalf. And I had that confusion around 5 years ago as well. And I see now that it hasn't cleared in my mind yet. So I just want to understand the added value of political capitalism here. This distinction between rational capitalism and political capitalism. Okay, in political capitalism, there is predatory political profits, profit on market from force and domination, so on and so forth. Who are we to say that we do not find those prospects or those characteristics in rational capitalism? And I understand your point about finance-dominated accumulation, and I understand the conversion of future income expectations into current use, and the fictitious capital argument, and how finance-dominated capitalism therefore has a fictitious base. But do we really have to use the term political to describe that form of capitalism? I don't see the added value of political there. I find it a bit confusing, because then it makes me wonder whether is there any capitalism that is not political, whether we can talk about a rational capitalism and a political capitalism, whether we can separate those two as such.
as far as I could get correctly, you put North Atlantic crisis in a wider context, which suggests taking into account 5 broader crises. One of them was crisis of U.S. hegemony within the post-1975 global order. So my question is, do you have any specific reasons for picking up the date 1975? And if you define a specific post-1975 time span of global order, when did that end, or is it still going on?
Hi, my name is Ibrahim. I'm studying industrial design. I want to know about your opinion about the effect of political capitalism on emerging markets. I'm from Egypt, so I know a little bit about what's going on in the region. So what do you think was the effect of political capitalism would be on the emerging markets in the Middle East and Africa in general? Thank you.
Better respond now. We had hoped by taking several questions they would group together neatly and I could just answer them with one fell blow, but actually they're very, very different questions. So in relation to the question, first of all, of the specificities of the Eurozone crisis. In part, it's the product of contagion within the context of the North Atlantic financial crisis. You might understand Cyprus, Iceland, Ireland, and the United Kingdom in that context as extreme forms, again, of hyper-financialization. But if you ask about the broader problem, this is where a particular approach that I adopt towards varieties of capitalism comes in. And rather than talking, as I think one must rather than talking only about the logic of the world market, I'd like to look at the organization of the world market in a more fractal way. So if I were making a statement about the overall dynamic of the world market logic, I would say what we're looking at is a variegated capitalism organized in the shadow of neoliberalism. That at a global level, that is the dominance of the logic of neoliberalism that's at work. And that's not just because of the mechanical aggregation of different varieties of capitalism, but because of the interdependencies between different systems. So some people have claimed, actually incorrectly, that the largest economy in the world is not China or the United States, but Chimerica. China and America, and they are pathologically codependent. So anybody knows about family theory knows that a pathologically codependent couple, the longer they stay together, the worse things get, but they can't imagine managing without each other. And you could not understand Chinese development or American development without looking at their interdependencies. But I don't believe that's a statement that one can make at that level of analysis that applies equally strongly to Europe. And I describe Europe as a variegated capitalism organized in the shadow of neo-mercantilism, the dominance of the model Deutschland, which has reorganized the logic of the Eurozone especially, but also the wider European economic space to serve the interests of the German model based on export-oriented growth. And if you look at the conditions for export-oriented growth, it's not a purely domestically oriented economy, but they have to keep exporting and exporting. That requires the subordination of other economies within that context. So there is a special dynamic to the Eurozone crisis that comes from the increasing incoherence of the European economy with each moment of expansion. The European Union started out more or less as 6 Rhenish economies, Rhineland economies. Each stage of expansion has introduced greater heterogeneity, constrained within a rather rigid institutional framework, which makes it very difficult to adjust crises tendencies within an individual nation or even within a region within a nation, particularly once you establish European monetary union. So what we're looking at, in contrast to China and America, which are pathologically codependent but have their own mechanisms of adjustment, we have a pathological codependence within the European Union between different European economies, between North and South, between the wider northern, what some people call the Eurozone, the northern Eurozone and southern Europe, but without the possibilities of more general adjustment. And indeed the solution, and it's a really paradoxical solution, is Germany, which has run its own economy by and large on neo-mercantilist lines, wants to rescue its neo-mercantilism by imposing neoliberalism on everybody else. And that creates a whole series of tensions and antagonisms and so forth. I've written a lot about that, but I wasn't able to refer to it here. So if you go to Jessop.org, which is my homepage, you can download more papers than you could shake a stick at on that topic, and that hopefully would be of some interest. As to the value of political capitalism, I have worked within the tradition of critical Marxist political economy for years. Enjoyed reading Capital, the Grundrisse, all those things, that people really enjoy reading in reading groups. And then I had to teach a course on Weber and discovered there's an awful lot of good sense in Weber as well. And even more good sense when I read his general economic history on varieties of orientation towards profit. The German is Erwerbsorientierung, different ways in which one can expect to gain a commercial return. And he then introduced this typology. And I think it's actually very useful, but in a certain sense also misleading, because rational in German does not mean what rational means in English. And what rational means in German is Zweckrationalität. It's the calculation of multiple opportunities and multiple costs involved. So basically, rational capitalism is the calculation of how, given competing opportunities for investment with different expected rates of return in the marketplace, in relatively free trade and through the rational organization of capitalist production, that's going to come. If you like, you could call that the efficient market hypothesis form of capitalism. And most of what Marx writes about in Das Kapital is at such a high level of abstraction that he assumes rationality in also a Weberian sense. But of course, that's not the way the world is out there. And so you also get in Marx the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. You get a discussion of Crédit Mobilier, of the rise of interest and banking capital. You get a whole series of other discussions of what Weber would call the forms of political capitalism. Weber himself points out the internal heterogeneity. But I see a link between Marx, Weber and Polanyi in his book on the Great Transformation, where he says that the market economy, liberalism, didn't emerge from the spontaneous operation of market forces. Liberalism was planned, and my argument would be the same. Finance-dominated accumulation did not emerge from the spontaneous operation of market forces. It was planned. It came about above all through unusual deals with political authority, all of that deregulation. Neoliberalism also introduces privatization, deregulation, liberalization, all again in and through legislation. But then if you look to see what happens when you privatize, you're basically, it's a form of predation. If you look to see how the mortgage companies that were offering liar loans were allowed to operate, it's a form of predation. If you look at student loans, it's a form of predation. And a large amount of capital accumulation in the financial sector is based on force, domination, and predation. Look at all of the big banks that have become bigger as a result of the crisis, not smaller, and the increasing number of lawsuits that are now being offered because of their manipulation of exchange rates, interest rates, and so forth and so forth. How is this possible? It's only possible because of political support for their predatory activities. And it seems to me that that is an absolutely useful distinction. You may not like the particular way in which Weber expresses it, but I think you have to recognize that there is a major difference between the classical defense of the market economy, whether it comes from neoclassical economics, from political liberalism, it comes even from Marx's analysis of the law of value, and what we see as increasingly dominant within the United States, within countries, economies that went down a neoliberal regime shift and so forth. And if you don't recognize that, then you're really not engaging adequately with the problem of what is the relationship between the symptoms and the underlying causes. Because the underlying causes are not the underlying causes of a market economy, the underlying causes are those grounded in one or another form of political capitalism. And that would be interesting even at a scientific level, but it's also interesting at a political level as well. Because if the rationale for capitalism is it sustains liberal democracy, and the rationale for liberal democracy is it enables a free market economy to operate, what we're seeing is that under attack. And that's what worries me. We've got two more questions. I'll try to deal with them more quickly. We've got the political capitalism. What's the rationale behind that? Oh, right, okay. I think there were really two different aspects to that. One was, what's the significance of 1975? And the other one was, what's the significance of decline of US hegemony? If we look at let me give you the more general. The Great Depression in the 1930s occurred when the United States was in the ascendant, and it could assume a role of world leadership. After 1945, it could set up the conditions for post-war economic expansion that benefited itself, but also benefited the wider community. With the United States in decline, and we might dispute the date, solving the problems for the United States is often inconsistent with solving the problems for everybody else. And I think that's the major thing, that this is not a rerun of the 1930s. Once you bring in the question is the United States in the ascendant, or is the United States in decline? And I think increasingly what we're seeing is not a hegemonic United States, but a dominant United States, using all of the power resources at its disposal to look after its own interests rather than to resolve the crises on a global scale in the interests of the global economic and political order. So that's why I think that is significant. And so for me, when it comes back to that Gramsci quote, when you're looking at a crisis, how far back in time do you go? How far out in space do you go? How many interactions are you looking at? And then what are the consequences of then defining the crisis by looking at just one among many different aspects? It's almost guaranteed that you'll fail if you have a single-stranded explanation, but it also means it may be much more difficult to mobilize the alliances that you need in order to solve it, because the only way you can mobilize the relevant set of resources, the relevant set of forces, is to have a much broader interpretation and show the interdependencies of many more forces. But also that, of course, then restricts your freedom, which is why I like the Karl Deutsch explanation. Power is the ability not to have to learn from your mistakes. Even if you've lost hegemony, if you're still dominant, you can still refuse to learn from your mistakes. But it's much more serious if you're not a hegemonic power not to learn from your mistakes than it is if you are hegemonic. So that's a... I would love to have that discussion with you on the basis of knowing something about the Middle East and North Africa and the consequences of that. What I am fairly well persuaded of is the Arab Spring and many of the other movements in Egypt and elsewhere are the product both of neoliberalism on a global scale, the impact of that particularly on incomes and on food prices above all, and the consequences then of the extension of imposition of neoliberalism within North Africa and the Middle East, or Middle East and North Africa, the MENA area. The consequences of that, given very low levels of income, very strong popular mobilization, I think is an interesting illustration of the interaction between the economic crisis and the political crisis. So these economic crises occurred in the context of a major political crisis. They're being resolved not only because of the strong state or the deep state in Middle East and North Africa, but also this is an example where the United States has its sticky fingers in and is giving a very strong push towards military and dictatorial resolutions of those crises tendencies. Beyond that, I can't say, but I am aware of work, and I could exchange names with you of people who've been comparing Egypt and Turkey as two forms of political capitalism at the Max Planck Institute in Cologne. I'm not sure how up to date they are with events in the last year or so, but then the notion of political capitalism has been applied to Egypt, to Turkey, and some very other interesting cases, not within the rentier state context, but yes, and well, developmental states also would be interesting in that context. We're more or less running out of time, I think, so it's up. I'm in your hands.
I think yes, we can conclude here. And again, thank you so much for this talk and also excellent discussion. Please join me again in thanking. I would like to invite now our rector, Professor Ahmet Acar, to present a token of appreciation to Bob Jessop.